The microphone hit the floor with a sound that echoed through every corner of the Family Feud studio. Steve Harvey's hand was still extended, frozen in midair, as if reaching for something he couldn't quite grasp. 300 people sat in absolute silence. The cameras kept rolling, but nobody was thinking about television anymore. What they were witnessing was something far more profound than entertainment. It was the moment when a 12-year-old boy in a wheelchair handed Steve Harvey a letter from his dead mother, and everything changed forever. But to understand what happened in that studio, you need to know what led to this moment. You need to know about the promise, the wheelchair, and the 3 words that would break Steve Harvey in a way he'd never been broken before. It was a Thursday morning in Atlanta, and the Rodriguez family had driven 18 hours from El Paso, Texas to be on Family Feud. They'd left at 3 in the morning, driving through the night in a modified van that could accommodate Timothy's wheelchair. Timothy Rodriguez was 12 years old, with dark brown hair that fell across his forehead and eyes that held both wisdom and pain in equal measure. He wore a red hoodie and blue jeans, and his sneakers, bright white Nikes that he'd insisted on wearing, had never touched pavement for more than a few steps. Timothy had been born with a rare form of muscular dystrophy. The doctors had said he'd never walk. His mother, Elena Rodriguez, had heard those words when Timothy was 3 years old, and she'd looked down at her son and made a promise. "They're wrong, Misho. One day you're going to walk. I don't know how, and I don't know when, but I promise you, one day you will run." Elena had spent the next 9 years fighting for that promise. She'd worked 3 jobs to pay for experimental treatments. She'd driven Timothy to physical therapy 5 days a week. She'd researched every possible option, every new procedure, every hope that medical science could offer. And through it all, she'd never let Timothy see her doubt, never let him see her cry, never let him believe for 1 second that walking was impossible. But 6 months ago, Elena's heart had given out. A massive coronary at age 41, in the parking lot of the grocery store where she worked as a night manager. She died before the ambulance arrived, before anyone could say goodbye, before Timothy could tell her one more time that he loved her. The Rodriguez family had fractured after that. Timothy's father, Miguel, had withdrawn into grief. His older sister, Sophia, 20 years old and suddenly responsible for everything, had tried to hold them together. His grandmother, Lucia, had moved in to help, but the weight of loss hung over their home like a permanent shadow. Then, 3 months after Elena's death, the letter from Family Feud arrived. They'd applied as a family almost a year ago, back when Elena was alive, back when they were still whole. Sophia had found the acceptance email in her mother's inbox, and for the first time since the funeral, she'd seen Timothy smile. "Mom wanted this," he'd said simply. "We have to go." Now they stood in the Family Feud studio. The Rodriguez family lined up at their podium. Miguel, Sophia, Lucia, Timothy's uncle Carlos, and Timothy himself, positioned at the end in his wheelchair. The opposing family, the Jennings from Michigan, smiled and waved from their podium. Steve Harvey, in his immaculate charcoal gray suit with a patterned burgundy tie, worked the crowd with his signature energy. All right, Steve called out, his voice filling the studio. "We got the Rodriguez family from El Paso, Texas. Now let me meet these beautiful people." He made his way down the line, shaking hands, asking questions, getting laughs. When he reached Timothy at the end, Steve did what he always did with younger contestants. He knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with the boy in the wheelchair. "And who do we have here?" Steve asked, his smile warm and genuine. "Timothy," the boy replied, his voice quiet but steady. "Timothy? That's a strong name, young man. How old are you?" 12. 12 years old. "And what do you want to be when you grow up?" Timothy looked directly into Steve's eyes, and for just a moment, something passed between them. Something that made Steve's smile falter slightly, though he recovered quickly. "I want to be a physical therapist," Timothy said, "so I can help people walk." The audience let out an appreciative "awe," and Steve nodded, patting Timothy's shoulder before standing up. But as he walked back to his podium, Steve glanced back at Timothy once more. There was something in the boy's eyes, that he couldn't quite identify, something that felt like it needed to be heard. The game began normally enough. The Rodriguez family was solid, competitive. Sophia was quick on the buzzer. Miguel surprised everyone with a #1 answer about things you find in a garage. The energy was good, the laughs were coming, and Steve was in his element. But during the third round, something shifted. The question was simple: name something that gives you hope. Sophia had just given a strong answer: faith, which lit up the #2 spot on the board. The family was celebrating and Steve was playing up the moment as he always did. But when he glanced over at the Rodriguez podium, he saw Timothy. The 12-year-old boy was crying. Not the happy tears of excitement, not the nervous tears of being on television. These were different. These were the tears of someone carrying something too heavy, something that had been building for too long. Steve's comedian instincts kicked in first. He started to make a joke, something light to ease what he assumed was just overwhelming emotion. But when Timothy looked up at him, Steve stopped mid-sentence. "You okay there, Timothy?" Steve asked, his tone shifting from entertainer to something more genuine. Timothy nodded, but the tears kept coming. His sister Sophia leaned down, whispering something to him, but Timothy shook his head. He reached into the pocket of his hoodie and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was worn, like it had been carried for a long time, opened and closed many times. "Steve," Timothy said, his voice cutting through the studio noise with surprising clarity. "Can I give you something?" The studio audience was still buzzing with energy from the previous answer, unaware of the intimate moment unfolding on stage. Steve looked at Timothy, then at the paper in the boy's hand, then at the production booth. Every instinct told him to keep the show moving, to handle this during commercial break, to maintain the pace that made good television. Instead, Steve Harvey made a choice that would define not just this episode, but his entire legacy as a host. "Stop the music," Steve called out to the production booth, his voice carrying an authority that immediately silenced the studio. "Stop everything." The theme music cut out mid-note. The audience fell silent. The camera operators, sensing something unprecedented, kept their lenses focused on Steve and Timothy. Steve walked across the stage to Timothy's wheelchair. He knelt down again, but this time it was different. This wasn't the host meeting a contestant. This was a man recognizing that another human being needed to be heard. "What do you want to give me, son?" Steve asked softly. Timothy held out the folded paper with both hands. His fingers were trembling. "It's from my mom," he whispered. "She wrote it before she died. She made me promise I'd give it to you if we ever got on the show." The studio was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Steve took the paper gently, as if it was something sacred. He could see the writing through the thin paper, neat and careful. The handwriting of someone who knew these might be among the last words she'd ever write. Steve unfolded the letter slowly. As his eyes moved across the words, something changed in his expression. The professional mask he wore for television cracked, revealing the man underneath. His jaw tightened. His eyes began to glisten. He read it once. Then he read it again. Then he looked at Timothy with an expression that no one in that studio had ever seen on Steve Harvey's face before. It was heartbreak, recognition, and determination all mixed together. "When did your mama pass?" Steve asked, his voice rough with emotion. 6 months ago, Timothy answered. "Heart attack. She was only 41. Steve nodded slowly, still holding the letter. He stood up, and without a word, he walked to the Jennings family podium. The competing family, who had been watching all of this unfold with growing concern and confusion, straightened up as Steve approached. "Jennings family," Steve said, his voice steady but different somehow. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Would you be willing to stop this game right now? This young man needs something more important than points on a board." Tom Jennings, the family patriarch, a man in his 50s with kind eyes, didn't hesitate. "Steve, you do whatever that boy needs. Games can wait." "Some things can't," Steve nodded, a small gesture of gratitude, then turned back to face the studio. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that transcended entertainment. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "I'm about to share something with you. Something that this young man's mother wrote before she passed away. She asked Timothy to give this to me, and I think she knew what she was doing." Steve walked back to Timothy and knelt beside his wheelchair once more. He held up the letter so the cameras could see it, though he didn't read it aloud word for word. Instead, he spoke directly to Timothy, his voice thick with emotion. "Your mama wrote here that you were born with a condition that doctors said meant you'd never walk. She wrote that she spent every day of your life fighting to prove them wrong. She took you to therapy, she researched treatments, she worked multiple jobs to pay for anything that might help. And she wrote that her biggest regret was that she wouldn't be here to see you take your first real steps." Timothy was sobbing now, his small frame shaking. Steve reached out and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "But here's what else she wrote, Timothy. She wrote that she knew you'd walk someday. Not because of medicine, not because of therapy, but because you have something inside you that's stronger than any muscle, any bone, any physical limitation. She wrote that you have her spirit, and that spirit doesn't know how to quit." The audience was crying now. Camera operators were wiping their eyes. Sophia had her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Miguel had his arm around his mother, both of them overwhelmed. But Steve wasn't finished. "Your mama also wrote something else in this letter," Steve continued, his voice gaining strength. "She wrote that if you ever got the chance to be on this show, I should tell you something for her. She wrote, 'Steve Harvey, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. But I need you to tell my son that his promise isn't over. Tell him that every day he wakes up is a day closer to walking. Tell him that I'll be watching, and when he takes those first steps, I'll be the proudest mama in heaven.'" Steve paused, letting those words settle over the studio like a benediction. Then he did something that no game show host in television history had ever done. He took off his suit jacket, the charcoal gray jacket that he'd worn for countless episodes, and he draped it carefully over Timothy's shoulders. "Timothy," Steve said, "I want you to keep this jacket, and I want you to know something. Your mama didn't just write a letter. She made me responsible for something. She made me responsible for making sure you never forget that promise." Steve reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. From it, he extracted a business card and wrote something on the back. "This is my personal number," he said, pressing the card into Timothy's hand. "Not my agent, not my assistant. Mine. And here's what I want you to do. When you take your first real steps, whenever that is, wherever that is, I want you to call me, because I made a promise to your mama. And Steve Harvey keeps his promises." The studio erupted in applause, but Steve raised his hand for silence. "We're not done," he said firmly. "Rodriguez family, Jennings family, producers, everybody listening, here's what's going to happen. This game is going to continue, but both families are playing together now. Every point, every dollar, it's all going to help Timothy get the treatment he needs, because that's what Elena Rodriguez would have wanted. That's what any mama would want." What happened next was unprecedented in game show history. Both families left their podiums and gathered around Timothy. The Jennings family, strangers from Michigan, knelt down and hugged the boy they'd never met before. Sophia held her brother while crying. Miguel placed his hand on his son's head, finally allowing himself to break down. Steve stood in the center of it all, directing the moment, not as a host, but as a human being who understood that some moments transcend television. The game resumed, but it was transformed. Both families worked together, calling out answers, celebrating every point. Steve asked questions specifically designed to make Timothy smile. When the boy laughed at one of Steve's silly faces, the entire studio erupted in joy. By the end of that impossible episode, Timothy had answered 2 questions himself. When Steve asked, "Name something that never dies," Timothy had answered, "Love." When he asked, "Name something worth fighting for," Timothy had said, "Promise." Neither answer was on the board. Both answers were better than anything the survey could have predicted, As the confetti fell and the celebration music played, Steve knelt next to Timothy one final time. He leaned in close and whispered something that the microphones didn't pick up. Whatever he said made Timothy's face transform from tears to the most radiant smile anyone in that studio had ever seen. Later, after the cameras stopped rolling, Steve did something else that no one expected. He went directly to the production office and made a series of phone calls. To his foundation, to medical specialists he knew, to physical therapy centers, to anyone who might be able to help Timothy Rodriguez fulfill his mother's promise. The episode aired 3 months later, and the response was unlike anything Family Feud had ever experienced. The show received over 3 million social media impressions in the first week. But more importantly, donations poured in from across the country. People who had been touched by Elena's letter, by Timothy's courage, by Steve's humanity, wanted to help. Within 6 months, Timothy had undergone a specialized surgical procedure, followed by intensive physical therapy. The treatment was experimental, risky, but Timothy had his mother's spirit. He fought through every painful session, every setback, every moment of doubt. 18 months after that episode aired, on a Tuesday afternoon in Atlanta, the Family Feud studio prepared for a regular taping. Steve Harvey was going through his usual pre-show routine when one of the producers approached him. "Steve," she said, her eyes shining with barely contained excitement, "we have a surprise for you." Steve followed her to the stage entrance. Standing there, supported on either side by his sister Sophia and his father Miguel, was Timothy Rodriguez. But Timothy wasn't in his wheelchair. He was standing on his own 2 feet. "Mr. Steve," Timothy called out, his voice stronger now, older somehow, "I have something to show you." Steve Harvey, the man who had made millions of people laugh over 4 decades of television, who had maintained his composure through every surprising moment the entertainment industry could throw at him, stood frozen. Timothy took a step forward, then another. His gait was unsteady, his legs shaky from lack of use, but he was walking, actually walking. "I kept my promise," Timothy said, taking another step. "I called your number, just like you said. But I wanted to show you in person." Steve walked forward to meet him. They met in the middle of the stage, and Steve wrapped the boy, now a young man of 14, in an embrace. "Your mama's watching," Steve whispered, "and she's the proudest woman in heaven." The studio staff who had gathered to witness this moment erupted in applause. But Steve and Timothy barely heard it. They were living in a moment that transcended applause, transcended television, transcended everything except the fulfillment of a promise made by a dying mother and kept by her son. Timothy still wore Steve's jacket to physical therapy every week. It had become his source of strength, his reminder that promises matter, that love doesn't end with death, and that sometimes a game show host can become exactly what a dying mother knew her son would need. Steve kept Elena's letter in his office, framed next to a photograph of Timothy taking those first steps. And every time someone asked him about his proudest moment in television, he didn't talk about ratings or awards or memorable episodes. He talked about a 12-year-old boy in a wheelchair who taught him what it really means to keep a promise.